Why, hello there, old sports. Now, usually I'm not the type to make or write theories, usually because I'm not very smart, or because the things I put together have been put together by others first, because it's obvious, and I'm just slow, like I just said. But this is an idea that I saw that I think is interesting enough to justify its own existence, and by that I mean it's interesting enough to justify me making a video about it. And after looking into the game some more, this idea might have some real potential. Even if I'm not the first person to come up with the idea, I just want to try to share it. Now, obviously, this video contains spoilers for Deltarune chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you have not played the game yet, or just do not want to be spoiled for anything that exists in the game currently, you have been warned. But then again, there's a really good chance this video will be obsolete at best in less than a year, so who knows? I'm just here to have some fun and share some ideas that I found cool. Now, the first thing I want to mention is that this theory, or at least my version of the theory, was spawned from this post and the accompanying image I saw on the Deltarune subreddit made by u/smallblueslime. But lo, on hopes and dreams they send, 3 heroes at the world's end. Now, obviously, the language, or the quote here, is from the prophecy panel we see in Chapter 4 in the Dark World, and the accompanying image is of fan art, sprites are art, some fan art showing 3 alternate heroes. At first I just thought this was some cool art, but then I thought some more, and from there I went down a rabbit hole. Now, all that I'm about to say might be interesting, or it could be completely stupid. I think I'm too far gone to tell. I just realized I'm 200 words into the theory, and I haven't even explained what my argument is yet, so that's my bad. Let me explain. Today, my goal is to convince you that Chris, Susie, and Ralsei are not the prophesized hero of legend that we hear about, but instead, they have been unknowingly and unwillingly placed into those roles early. First of all, I'd like to establish that Ralsei's version of the prophecy is suspect at best and outright wrong at worst. He admits himself that he changed some details in Chapter 4. It seems that the prophecy images we see in the church's dark world are more accurate, especially considering that Susie sees something she doesn't want to in her own dark world. If the prophecy slides we saw were based upon the creator of the dark world, or how they saw the prophecy, Susie probably wouldn't see something like she did. I'd also like to point out her language when we do find her after she shatters the slide. She specifically says that they wouldn't do something the slide said, or they wouldn't let it happen. I don't think whatever Susie saw was just something bad, but it was something the gang wouldn't do under usual circumstances. This may also be another clue that her group aren't the heroes of legend. Maybe the gang wouldn't do whatever that was, because they aren't the ones that are supposed to do whatever it is in the first place. But that's a weaker point, I will admit. Next up, I'd like to bring up a line from the prophecy that's always seemed out of place to me. Now again, this may be a moot point if it was a detail Ralsei changed, but I'll get to why I don't think that is in a moment. But if this harmony were to shatter, a terrible calamity would occur. The sky will run black with terror, and the land will crack with fear. Then, her heart pounding, the earth will draw her final breath. Only then, shining with hope, 3 heroes appear at World's Edge, a human, a monster, and a prince from the dark. The prophecy Ralsei tells us mentions that 3 heroes will only appear after the calamity, aka the roaring, has occurred. The ending of that version of the legend also mentions that the balance is starting to shift as a new fountain appears on the horizon. So I think it's very clear that at least according to the prophecy, the heroes are only supposed to save the day after the roaring begins. It's also made clear that this hasn't happened yet. Ralsei even warns Birdly in Chapter 2 that he will cause the roaring if he opens up another fountain in the Dark World, which again tells us that the roaring has not begun yet. I'd also like to mention that that earlier line, low on hope, like the one that accompanied the image I just showed a bit earlier, that also kind of alludes to the heroes will appear at the world's end, at the roaring. So that alone calls into suspicion as to how we can be the heroes when the apocalypse hasn't even started yet. I also doubt that this is a detail Ralsei change, because it would make no sense to add that detail in, Also, as I just mentioned, it's sort of mentioned in the the reliable prophecy. Most of the stuff he seemed to change were changes that would make it easier for Chris and Susie to begin their quest. But why would he add that detail when, if anything, that would only make Chris and Susie more suspicious of him? Now, this by itself is just odd, and it doesn't prove anything alone, but I think it's a good first step to establish doubt in our idea of the heroes of legend. Now, you might be wondering, if the Lancer Fan Club aren't the heroes of legend, where are the heroes mentioned in the prophecy? And who are they? And that's a very good question. First of all, considering Schrodinger's roaring hasn't occurred yet, we might have seen the heroes, or they might not be playing the roles, but we might have seen them, but they haven't taken up those roles yet. But we might have clues on who the heroes are supposed to be, starting with, the first human hero is described as the cage with human soul in parts, which is so odd that Susie even brings up how weird it is to refer to Chris as a cage. What my mind first jumps to is that the discarded vessel from Chapter 1 was originally going to play the role of the human hero, considering it is a human, even if it's the goner version of a human. I'd also like to mention that we, the soul, are not the human hero, and the prophecy panel points this out as well. The hero has a human soul in parts, and it is not the human soul. They're specifically separated. It's a human cage with a human soul in parts. I also think the specific wording calling the hero a cage is important. I might be reading into things too much, but the term cage has always had a negative connotation to me, and if us as the player are the angel, as some theorize, it would make sense that a human body would be kind of like a cage for a being of our power in the world. Now, I will admit that this theory has some holes, and I don't expect the whole thing to be necessarily true or correct or come true in future chapters, but if I had to bet on any part of this theory being true, it would be that Susie isn't the monster hero, but Noelle is. Honestly, while I feel like you have to look a little harder to find evidence that Chris and Ralsei aren't the heroes of legend, I feel like the game is almost trying to tell you that Susie isn't. All throughout Chapter 4, and the game as in completion, or not completion, the game as a whole of what we have so far, Susie has the weird property of breaking progression, to put it lightly. It's also pretty clear that Susie isn't being depicted in the prophecy panels, or at least as clear as it can be without outright telling us. First of all, Susie cannot use a sword despite the monster hero being depicted in the prophecy panels using one. However, through data mining, Noelle can equip some weapons that can usually only be used by Chris, who uses blades in combat, such as the black shard we get from the knight at the end of Chapter 3. This isn't really hard evidence, but the monster hero also gets the most build-up in panels, while the human and the prince only get 1 or 2. On a meta level, I feel like there's more build-up here because there's going to be a bait and switch. But then again, that's just a feeling, and Toby might be doing a bait and stay the same, because he knows we'll think it's a bait and switch. But then again, I'm probably just overthinking things. As I said, this isn't really hard evidence, it's just a gut feeling. I'd also like to bring up the line about the girl finding love. Susie doesn't necessarily find that same love on all routes. Now, before I go in depth on that point, I'd like to bring up that the weird route might intentionally go against the prophecy, but then again, it might also be the intended outcome of the prophecy. It's too early to tell exactly. But going back to my first point, on the weird route, both major moments Susie has to connect with Noelle are lost or changed in some way. Now you might be thinking, well, if these moments are lost or changed, doesn't that affect Noelle the same way as Susie? Well, I'd like to bring up something. In this series, love has more than one meaning. On the normal route, Noelle connects with Susie, and falls in love. But on the weird route, she gets stronger and distances herself, gaining love instead, capitalized. Overall, I think the game is at very least hinting that Susie isn't one of the heroes, even if Chris and Ralsei are. Going back to the meta angle, Susie's line about how she's glad to be important almost screams to me that a scene where she loses it because she learns she isn't important is in store for us somewhere down the line. Moving on from Susie, we have the final prophesized hero, the Prince from the Dark. Now, I'll be honest, I don't really have much here, and anything I do have can be explained away more cleanly with other explanations if you look hard enough. But there's one thing that most of you haven't considered, I'm an Undertale fan. I don't have reading comprehension or common sense. Anyways, when we first meet Ralsei, he's wearing a cloak similar to the one that the figure in the prophecy wears in both versions. Ralsei also disguises himself within that disguise with the hat. So, it feels like he's trying to go out of his way to hide his identity from us for some reason. I never really thought Ralsei was evil, but rather just hiding something, and Chapter 4 just solidified that idea for me. My point here being that Ralsei is no stranger to hiding things from the player, and even Chris to a slightly lesser extent. So if Ralsei wasn't the Prince from the Dark, he'd probably put the most effort into making Chris and Susie think otherwise, rather than trying to reassure them that they're in the prophecy. I don't really have any proof of, or I don't really have any idea, even, of who the Prince from the Dark could be if it isn't Ralsei. I don't know, maybe it's Lancer. Yeah, it's probably Lancer. Anyways, to go back over my ideas, I think that the heroes of legend are not Chris, Susie, and Ralsei, and that the actual heroes haven't taken up their roles quite yet, and that we might end up running into them whenever we do start the roaring, because again, I highly doubt they'll introduce the concept of the roaring and not have it take place, especially when we're supposed to stop the roaring, like mid-apocalypse. At the very least, I do think that Susie is not in the prophecy the way she thinks, because Gerson in his battle mentions a dragon, and Susie takes that as referring to her, but in that version of the story, which is a changed version of the story, that's important to keep in mind, they slay the dragon. So, maybe at some point Susie is involved in the prophecy, but not in a good way. And I do think Noelle has a more important role to play, but pretty much everyone agrees on that. I also believe that the vessel we made was supposed to play a bigger role, but it was shafted by some, as of now, unseen force. Ralsei is hiding something, but again, that's not really news. We've all known that since Chapter 1, so yeah. Anyways, this is a pretty simple and short theory I kind of developed based off of some stuff I saw, including that piece of fan art, and I thought this was a cool idea, so I wanted to share it with the wider Deltarune community. I'll be honest, this might be a little half-baked, because I know this will probably be debunked in less than a year, so I don't want to put too much investment into it, either emotionally or logically, I guess. And again, this is my first time ever trying to make a theory video, so I hope it was at least okay, even if it doesn't end up being right. But at the end of the day, I'm having fun with this, and that's partially what theorizing is about in the first place. And hey, I managed to go a whole Deltarune theory without even mentioning Gaster. Wait, fuck!